Hello, welcome back to Whisper of the Night, where stories aren't just told, they're whispered to your soul. If you're here, perhaps sleep feels distant tonight, or maybe you're simply looking for something real, a quiet truth to hold on to in the dark. Tonight's story is not just a fairy tale. It's a reflection, a haunting, a quiet unraveling of one girl's descent into obsession and the silence that follows once the music fades. It's called The Red Shoes, and I promise you won't hear it the same way again. So close your eyes, let the world slip away, and let me take you somewhere deeper. They say poverty humbles the soul, but for her it carved a craving, not for food, not even for warmth, but for beauty. Karen had grown up with nothing but calloused souls and threadbare clothing. She had never known the feel of velvet, nor the shine of polished leather. Her world was the crunch of frozen soil underfoot and the grey fog of forgotten mornings. She had no mother, only a shadow of memory and the faint scent of lavender that sometimes drifted in when she was coldest. Her shoes, if one could call them that, were stitched from scraps, barely holding together. The other children mocked her, calling her barefoot bride when they saw her stumbling through snow. But she didn't cry. Instead, she looked at their polished boots and pretty bows with a silent, burning desire. One day, as fate would spin it, an old shoemaker took pity on her. He crafted a pair of shoes for her out of leftover red leather, scraps he couldn't use elsewhere. They weren't elegant, but they were red, and to Karen, they were fire in a life of ash. She wore them every day. She danced in them, walked to church in them, even though they were unfit for such reverence. The townsfolk whispered. Red was not a colour for the pious. It was the colour of sin, of temptation, of women who swayed their hips and never bowed their heads. But Karen didn't care. When she wore the red shoes, people looked, and being looked at made her feel alive. Then came the old widow. She arrived in a black carriage, pale and stern, her hands wrapped in lace, her eyes sharp behind thick veils. She had no children, no heir, only wealth and the memory of a daughter lost long ago. When she saw Karen kneeling by the road, her dress stained with mud and sorrow, something in her cracked. She took the girl home, fed her, dressed her, bathed her in silence and named her anew, Child of Fortune. Karen should have been grateful, but all she could think about were her red shoes, confiscated, burned, declared unfit for a respectable girl. She obeyed, she smiled, she curtsied in her plain black shoes. But inside her, something twisted, and it began to whisper. A smile is not obedience. The widow taught Karen many things: how to pour tea without sound, how to walk like a shadow, how to speak only when spoken to. In that grand, cold house filled with ticking clocks and portraits with eyes that never blinked, Karen learned silence. But she never learned peace. Every morning she woke in silk sheets and watched the light filter through lace curtains. She wore fine black dresses now, modest, proper. Her hair was combed and pinned. Her hands were always folded. People praised her transformation. Such a well-mannered girl, they said, so obedient, so good. But they didn't see the girl who stared at her reflection too long, who sometimes touched her bare feet under the table, remembering the sting of snow and the feel of worn-out leather. They didn't see the way her eyes lingered on colour, red berries in the winter garden, a passing carriage with crimson trim, the smear of lipstick on a visiting lady's handkerchief. Red, it was everywhere and nowhere, like a ghost. She dreamt of the shoes often. In her sleep, she danced down the church aisle wearing them, her steps light, head held high, while the congregation stared, some in judgment, others in envy. She didn't stop. She twirled, she floated, she laughed in red. But then she'd wake, breathless, alone. The widow noticed the change. "Why are you so quiet these days?" she asked one evening, her tone more curious than kind. "I'm just tired, ma'am." "You should be grateful," the woman said. "Girls like you, orphans, should not dream too much, yet dreams are for those who can afford to fall." Karen nodded, but she thought, what if I never wanted to fall, only to fly? One Sunday they went to church for a special service. The whole town was present. Girls wore their finest dresses. Mothers dusted off heirloom hats. Karen walked behind the widow, her head bowed. But something stopped her. In a shop window, just for a breath of a moment, she saw them. Red shoes. Not the ones she had as a child. These were different, sleeker, glossier, with silk bows and silver buckles. They seemed to pulse behind the glass like a heartbeat. Her own heart stuttered in reply. "Karen," the widow called sharply. She turned, but not before the hunger inside her opened again. Deeper this time, like a wound that had only pretended to heal. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, counting the lines in the ceiling. Somewhere, a storm brewed. Thunder in the distance. Wind tapping at the shutters like fingers asking to be let in. She got up, dressed, took the widow's umbrella, silent as snowfall, and she walked to the shop. The town was dark. Even the moon seemed to hide behind clouds, as if it too didn't want to witness what she was about to do. When she reached the window, the shoes were gone. Her breath caught, but the door was slightly open. No clerk, no lights, just the faint scent of leather and dust. She stepped inside, and there they were, waiting, as if they had always known she'd return. She touched them. The leather was warm, almost alive. They fit perfectly. And when she slipped them on, she smiled for the first time in months, but a smile is not obedience. Karen wore the red shoes to the market beneath the widow's long coat. They peeked out with every step, just a flicker, a hint, a flash of colour against the grey cobblestones. But even a flicker was enough. Heads turned. Children stopped mid-play. Housewives whispered behind gloved hands. Old men blinked twice before lowering their eyes. And Karen walked straighter. The widow didn't notice at first. She was too busy haggling over fruit, snapping at vendors for bruised apples. But Karen felt it. The shift in the air, the heat of attention. Some eyes lingered with admiration, others narrowed in judgment. But they all saw her now. After so long being invisible, she almost mistook it for love. That evening, she stood before the mirror, her skirts lifted slightly to admire the shoes. They were even more beautiful in candlelight, glowing like embers. Dangerous. Alive. "You shouldn't wear those again," a voice inside her said. "You know what they make you feel." But feeling was better than fading. So she wore them again and again, to the chapel, to the bakery, to the widow's Sunday tea. At first, the widow said nothing. She only frowned once, eyes flicking down to the floor during grace. Then came the remark, "Those shoes are rather loud, don't you think?" Karen smiled politely. "They're just shoes, ma'am." But they weren't. She wore them when no one was watching, too, dancing in the attic, her movements silent but ecstatic. They made her feel untouchable, rebellious, seen. But she began to notice something else. The looks. The young apprentice at the tailor's shop no longer smiled when she passed. The baker's wife, once so warm, now tightened her lips. Even the vicar, who used to nod kindly, began to look through her rather than at her. Their eyes no longer said admiration. They said audacity, impropriety, shame. And yet, she could not stop. She polished the shoes until they gleamed. She matched her ribbons to their red. She imagined being older, in grand halls where people danced and applauded and no one whispered. But here, she was not a girl in beautiful shoes. She was a girl being judged for wearing them. It confused her, enraged her, excited her. Why did the world give her colour and then demand she not wear it? Why teach her to disappear and then hate her for being invisible? The contradiction scratched at her soul. She remembered a woman in the market, older, in dark shawls, who had stared at her with something sharper than disapproval, something closer to pity. "You think they'll make you someone else?" the woman had muttered as Karen passed. Karen didn't respond. She didn't have to. She had the shoes, and the shoes made her feel real. But at night, the mirror was less kind. She'd look at herself, dressed perfect, hair neat, red shoes burning like fire beneath her, and ask, "Am I admired, or am I being watched for all the wrong reasons?" She did not yet know the answer, but she was beginning to suspect that love and loathing often wore the same face, and that once the eyes of the world are upon you, they never fully look away, not even when you wish they would. The red shoes danced on. At first, they danced with flair, catching the eye of every stranger she passed. Karina basked in it. The admiration, the curiosity, the envy. People didn't know her name, but they knew the girl with the red shoes. They smiled at her, praised her daring. She had become a story whispered between cracks of daily monotony, an anomaly in a world dulled by conformity. But the shoes didn't stop dancing. She tried to rest at benches on stairwells in the quiet corners of her mind, but the steps continued. Even when she slept, her legs twitched with phantom movements, her toes curling in restless rhythm. Her body ached, but worse, her will began to erode. She wanted to take the shoes off. Not because she hated them, but because she was no longer sure who she was without them. She had become the performance. The red shoes danced, and she followed. The girl beneath the glittering spectacle faded, like music that lingers too long and begins to feel hollow. And yet she smiled. She laughed. She posed. Because they were still watching. There were days the shoes dragged her places she didn't want to go, parties she had no strength to attend, conversations she didn't feel part of, but she danced through them anyway because they still expected her to. Because if she stopped, what would be left? There was a moment, a quiet night, a mirror, a flickering light. She stood still for a second too long and looked at her reflection, not at her face, not at the dress, but at the shoes. They were no longer red, they were crimson, dark and hungry, stained maybe. From what? She didn't know. Maybe from the streets, the exhaustion, the sacrifices. Or maybe they were bleeding. She reached down to untie them. Her fingers trembled. The laces were gone. The shoes had no fastenings now, just a seamless grip over her feet, like skin grown over something alien. She pulled harder. They did not budge. Panic rose in her throat, but it was too late. The music had begun again. Not from outside, but inside her. And her feet moved, and the world blurred, and the spotlight returned. But this time no one clapped. People watched with cold eyes, curious, yes, but not kind. Her movements were no longer admired, they were studied, dissected. She had become an object, a warning, a thing to look at but not reach for. She smiled, the mask was familiar now. Inside, Karina wondered if she had ever really worn the shoes or if they had worn her from the beginning. Karina began to forget how to stand still. Stillness used to be natural. Pause in conversation, a moment of thought, the comfort of existing without purpose. But now, every time her body paused, the shoes would twitch, reminding her they were still there. That she owed them movement, that her body had no right to rest unless it had earned it. And who decided what was earned anymore? Not Karina. Not for a long time. She started to fear quiet rooms. In silence, the shoes grew louder. Not in sound, but in command. A tension in her ankles, a pressure in her chest, a whisper beneath her skin. Keep going, keep going, keep going. She danced at funerals. She danced during phone calls she couldn't bear to make. She danced when the doctor said her knees were deteriorating. She danced when the mirror no longer recognized her, and she smiled. Always the smile. The audience had changed, smaller now, less impressed, but she gave them the same mask. Because performing was no longer an act, it was survival. Or maybe simply habit. She tried once to confess, to a stranger in a coffee shop, to someone who looked kind. "I'm tired," she said, but the words felt foreign in her mouth. Like a truth too raw to hold shape, the stranger blinked awkwardly and replied, "We all are." And Karina laughed, because wasn't that just it? Everyone's tired, everyone's dancing, so why should she be the one to stop? Still, the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, for the first time in years, she didn't pretend to enjoy the dance. She let her face fall blank, her eyes hollow. She looked at the ceiling as the rhythm dragged her across her apartment floor like a puppet on invisible strings. And she whispered, barely audible, "Please, stop." It wasn't a scream, not a rebellion, just a breath. But the shoes heard it, and they responded, not by slowing, but by changing the rhythm. Faster, harder, more violent. Pain shot up her legs like fire. Her knees buckled, but the shoes held her upright. Her feet bled again. She tasted metal in her mouth from the effort not to cry. This was the price for daring to wish. This was the punishment for praying for silence. But even as she collapsed, face pressed to the cold wooden floor, legs trembling in unnatural positions, Karina felt something new. Not relief, but clarity. The shoes were never hers. They never had been. They were a symbol of the hunger to be seen, of the addiction to approval, of the belief that value comes only from motion, from sacrifice, from spectacle. And now that hunger had consumed her. She lay there, her heart pounding out a rhythm the shoes no longer needed. And for a single second, the world held its breath. When morning came, Karina was still lying on the floor. The shoes had stopped moving, not out of mercy, but exhaustion. Her body had given all it could, muscles torn, joints swollen, skin torn open in places where the blood had long dried. She couldn't tell if she was awake or dreaming. All she knew was that for the first time in years there was no rhythm, no music, just breath, and it was hers. The stillness didn't feel like peace, it felt like aftermath, like the hollow silence after an explosion when all the noise has fled but the damage remains. She turned her head slowly toward the window. Morning light filtered in, soft and unassuming. The kind of light she used to sleep through after long rehearsals, the kind of light that had once meant rest. Karina tried to sit up. Her body screamed, not in protest but in memory. Every movement reminded her of what the shoes had taken, what she had given. She crawled, inch by inch, toward the mirror across the room. She needed to see it, needed to know what was left. When she finally reached it, what stared back was not a dancer, not a performer, not even a woman in pain. It was a creature shaped by survival, eyes sunken, cheeks hollow, limbs marked by years of sacrifice. And yet, there was something real in that reflection. Not pretty, not poetic, but true. Karina pressed her palm to the glass. "I see you now," she whispered, and for the first time, the shoes didn't respond. Later that day, a neighbour found her outside, barefoot, bare for the first time in so long, her feet raw and wrapped in torn fabric. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't dancing. She was sitting on a bench, staring at the sky like it was the first time she'd looked up without asking for applause. When asked what happened to her shoes, she simply replied, "I outgrew them." But the truth lived deeper. She hadn't been freed. She had chosen to stop, even as the shoes screamed for more, even as the rhythm clawed at her bones. She had finally said no. It hadn't come with angels or fireworks or a grand curtain fall. It came with silence and pain, and the soft, steady pulse of a woman who had decided to live without performance. Karina would never dance again, not in the way she used to, but sometimes late at night she would feel the rhythm returning, not from the shoes, but from within. A heartbeat, a breath, a quiet song that belonged only to her, and that perhaps was enough.